everything works just fine. There's nothing bad I can say about it, but God, there's nothing great or interesting to say about it either. It merely exists. There's an argument that you might have seen around or you might have taken part in yourself. What's worse? For something to be really, really bad, or for something to be completely mediocre? For me, the answer is obvious. It's way more interesting for something to be really, really bad. Think about any book, film, video game, any piece of entertainment media that is famously bad. Think about how it takes up so much space in public discourse. Think about all the fun and funny conversations you've had about those things. About hilariously bad movies like Tommy Wiseau's The Room. Bad things are fun, but it goes beyond that. A bad work of art is actually kind of fun to analyze, to critique, to pick apart, figure out why it's so bad, where it went wrong, and maybe even how it could have been better. There's as much to talk about when it comes to a really bad work of art as there is with a really good one. Quite often a really bad work of art might have had something interesting to say and completely failed and made a mockery of itself. There's so much potential fun and almost academic challenge to be had in talking about and critiquing and breaking down a bad work of art, whatever it is. But mediocrity, something that is completely mid, something that's aggressively fine, average, serviceable, is also completely forgettable. It feels like it serves no purpose. It did its job adequately, and then we all just get to move on. And unfortunately, that is exactly the case with Leigh Bardugo's The Familiar, a novel I was very, very excited about. In case you don't know who she is, Leigh Bardugo wrote the perfectly fine Shadow and Bone YA fantasy trilogy, the very cool, very original, very unique Six of Crows duology, a gritty and nasty piece of dark academia, Ninth House, although I haven't read the sequel yet. And now this, The Familiar, a piece of historical fantasy that is absolutely and completely fine. It is aggressively, frustratingly mid. I am already forgetting this book, and that is not a good thing. I am annoyed by this, and because it's mid, because of everything I just said at the beginning, I feel like I don't have a lot to say, so let's just talk about why it's so mid. The problem with The Familiar is that it doesn't offer up a single original idea. Not in its characters, not in its story and plot, not in its events, not in its relationships, not in its themes, nothing at all. All the way through this book, I kept likening it to other things. Constantly. I don't like using the word derivative for some reason, but I can't really think of another one. The Familiar is set in Madrid during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Our protagonist is a scullery servant in a kind of rubbish wealthy house. This family are not really impressive. They are not that affluent. They're kind of an embarrassment when it comes to the high society people of Madrid. And our protagonist, Lucia, works in this house. Lucia also has an aunt in town. Her relationship to her aunt is kept secret for various reasons. They downplay their relationship, and they also hide the fact that they are Jewish. This is the time of the Spanish Inquisition. But Lucia also has some magical gifts. There are things that she can do. Very typical magic. Kind of Sabrina the Teenage Witch kind of magic. Fixing things, moving things around, blah blah blah. This kind of magical manipulation is a thing that happens in this world, this alternate history. There are people who claim to speak with angels. People who claim to have clairvoyant abilities. And Lucia is one of these people. And when the wife of this house, Valentina, finds out about Lucia's powers, she realizes that she can use them to get closer to the courts, to be a more impressive member of high society, to finally feel like she matters, to get the rest of the bourgeoisie to pay attention to her and her household. Lucia's aunt introduces her to one of her patrons, another wealthy gentleman, and this wealthy gentleman has an indentured servant. This servant is a strange, enigmatic man who never ages. He has served this family for a long, long time. He has a very mysterious past, some weird powers of his own, there's a lot you don't know about him, he's vaguely intriguing. And when the book began, I thought, that's kind of like Cinderella. When it started world building about all the different magic peoples, I thought, well, take your pick. X-Men came to mind first, but we are drowning in media and art about societies where some people are magic and some people are not, and in these stories sometimes it's a secret and sometimes it's not, sometimes being magic is a good thing and sometimes it's not, sometimes having powers makes you powerful and sometimes it makes you an outcast. There are thousands of books and films and TV shows and cartoons about this, and we have another one here. The familiar. Then, as Lucia is kind of brought into this high society world, she finds out that there is a kind of competition amongst these magical people. The girl who can talk to angels, the boy who is clairvoyant, and Lucia. There is a contest where these people from different walks of life, some rich, some poor, compete against each other using their powers, and I started thinking about things like the Hunger Games. Every single idea, every single plot point that this book stumbles into has been done before. It adds nothing to the conversation at all. Around the halfway point, you get the inkling that there's going to be a romance. Oh, good. Right, I hadn't even considered that, actually. I was just thinking about Lucia being a poor servant girl and having something to prove and a chip on her shoulder and the high society people manipulating her for their own gains and her hoping to get something from it and feel proud and blah, blah, blah. Themes and themes and themes that we've seen before, and then you get the romance as well, and you're like, of course, there's a romance. Fine, okay, let's see where this goes. And oh my god, there's nothing original in this book. It's pointless. It is entirely forgettable. It is a paint-by-numbers story. And now we come up to the big question. Is that bad? Is there a problem in that? Does it matter that The Familiar is a completely forgettable, unremarkable novel? No. But if we circle back to the beginning, aren't we all immediately conscious of the fact that The Familiar will just get forgotten, that it's a work of art by a reasonably talented author that will just get forgotten because it does nothing interesting or new or original. It takes no risks at all. It just serves as simple, light entertainment. But it's also not that. It's not like that popcorn cinema genre of books, the romantasy stuff, the Rebecca Yarros and Sarah J. Maas stuff. Admittedly, I haven't read any of their books, but it doesn't feel like it fits into that genre based on what I know about it. Those books are unremarkable and uninteresting from what I've heard, but they serve a specific purpose to a specific audience. They are absurd and campy, wild and ridiculous escapism. Great, they have their place. Bad stuff gets remembered because it gets analysed to death. Good stuff is remembered for great reasons. What is this? What will The Familiar's legacy be? It frustrates me. And it frustrates me, obviously, because I like the works of Leigh Bardugo. She's a good author. Six of Crows, as I said, is awesome. Ninth House is a lot of fun and pretty unique. She's done daring and fresh things with genres before, usually fantasy-adjacent stuff. In fact, always fantasy-adjacent stuff. And I have to admit, I did go into this book thinking it was purely an historical novel, and I thought, yet again, Leigh Bardugo's doing something fresh. She's leaving fantasy behind, she's leaving magic behind, and she's going into purely historical fiction. Set during the Spanish Inquisition, that's cool, that's unusual, that's exciting. Oh, here's the magic, and the magic isn't interesting, and the character is poor and thrust into high society, and this is like every single YA novel, although I guess it's not technically YA. And I just started falling apart as I read it, thinking this is nothing at all. Paint by numbers is the thing. It is frustratingly, aggressively mid. It has nothing new to say. Its themes are just being peddled to you and will feel so familiar. And in fact, now that I've realized that joke this late in the video, everything is in fact very familiar. The characters and their relationships will be familiar to anyone who's read a book before. As will the themes, as will everything that plays out in the plot. Admittedly, Shadow and Bone didn't change the shape of the universe. It didn't do anything fresh and exciting, but from the world that she built with Shadow and Bone, we got the Six of Crows duology, which I really, really liked. Ninth House was a pretty original idea in the world of dark academia, which is a constantly blossoming and expanding genre, and Ninth House remains something interesting in that genre. The familiar is too familiar. I'm already forgetting so much about this book. It's frustrating because I like the author, but I also know that this book is just going to get forgotten because it's a middle-of-the-road book that is impossible to review because it does nothing interesting and nothing at all bad. It is serviceable in every sense. It is perfectly well written, well plotted, decently realized characters who are pretty three-dimensional. Everything works just fine. There's nothing bad I can say about it, but God, there's nothing great or interesting to say about it either. It merely exists, and oh well. Now I guess I move on to something interesting. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week, and this is a really fun one because I get to recommend it too. Nick recommends Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, a book that I also adore. Nick said, I really enjoyed Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, which I haven't seen reviewed in a lot of places. I felt like the story and characters had a lot of depth, and the surreal and horror elements were there enough to fill that need for me. Also, I haven't read a lot about Canadian Indigenous communities, so that was also interesting. Agreed, Nick, absolutely. This is a really underrated, pretty modern horror novel. It only came out a year or two ago. I really enjoyed it. It's a really good page-turner, and yeah, an Indigenous Canadian writer writing a horror novel about Canadian Indigenous communities. Jessica Johns is the Canadian Stephen Graham Jones, I guess. If you like horror and you want to read more Indigenous voices, absolutely check out Bad Cree. Thank you so much to Nick for that recommendation. And if you also want to recommend books that I will read out at the end of videos each week, you can support me on Patreon. My Patreon community is the reason this channel exists at all, and if you think I have earned your support with the stuff that I put out, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The money I get from Patreon is not extra spending money, it is my salary. It is my entire livelihood, and I can never ever thank my patrons enough for what they do. So consider it. Let me know if you've read The Familiar and what you thought of it. Sorry if I've put you off reading it and you were excited to read it. I know I've already done that to a few people on social media. And subscribe for books.